Hey guys, we've been reading The Trouble with Lemons in 8th grade ELA class, and we left off on Monday. We were trying to read chapter 5, and then snow and ice, and so we were supposed to finish chapter 5 in class. We didn't, and you were, as homework, supposed to finish chapter 5 and read through chapter 6. So I have a sneaky feeling that not all of us got through all that. And I also have a feeling that some of us were a little distracted by the weather when we were reading chapter 5. I'm going to go through and do some read alouds. Just for those of us that prefer to listen to this story and for those of us that prefer an audiobook. So here we go. We're going to start on page 34 with chapter 5. Buster owned a faded old gray Cadillac with fins pointing out the back that looked like rocket engines. It even sounded like a rocket when Buster tromped on the gas and roared onto Main Street. The guy drove like a total maniac. Sitting between Buster and Limey, I sank into a few layers of Buster each time we screeched into a hard right turn and got elbowed by Limey on the lefts. Buster blew thick clouds of cigar smoke that quickly filled up the car. I wondered how he'd take it if I threw up all over his front seat. And I tried to get the thought out of my mind. Thinking about throwing up isn't that far away from actually throwing up. Dozens of cars lined the road on both sides of the quarry entrance. The people strolling down the lane looked like they could have been going to the county fair. At least until Buster veered in, blasting his horn and swearing out the window. A volunteer fireman in an orange vest planted his feet in front of us and thrust out his arm. Until Buster hit the gas, that is. Then his feet got unplanted pretty quickly. A fire truck, 2 state trooper cars, a sheriff car, and a rescue van were parked by the water, all with lights flashing every which way. A large crowd milled about. The new arrivals craned their necks to see, and the ones who'd been there a while shook their heads and spoke in hushed tones like people do at a wake. We scrunched up behind Buster as he plowed through the crowd to the water's edge. Way out in the middle, a state trooper sat in a blue and yellow trooper rowboat, peering over the side into the gray water. Every so often, 2 divers in black suits would surface and direct him to move the boat this way or that. The body must have sunk, and it would probably be tough to spot it in the dark water. A few yards from where we stood, a large, shapeless woman sobbed quietly, and 2 men tried to comfort her. She kept repeating, "I know it's him. He's never stayed out all night. Oh, God, I know it's him." The men looked awkward and helpless, and every once in a while they'd say something like, "Now, Claire, we don't even know for sure anyone is in there." But it didn't do any good. She seemed to know, as sure as Limey as I knew, that a body was in there, and it was pitiful to watch her stunned misery. The men might as well have shut up. There was no way anybody could make her feel any better. I turned away and fixed my eyes on the water, and closed them pretty fast when I remembered what might come floating up. Suddenly, I wanted to get out, to be as far away as possible from that poor woman and the bodies as possible. But I walked in by people. I wished I could go do something. Play basketball, run, anything that would take my mind off this woman and the body and all the misery and suffering that come from tragedies like this one. I drew in a deep breath and tried to stop thinking, but it was too late. My mind was already back to last summer, the worst summer I'd ever had. Dad had been furious that I'd screwed up so bad at prep school, less than 3 months there, and they didn't even want me back. I told him I wouldn't have gone back anyway, and that sent him through the roof again. My allergies were going crazy, and I was practically a basket case. By early August, I'd had 3 or 4 asthma attacks within a month, as well as a bunch of other symptoms that came and went, like dizziness and nosebleeds that wouldn't stop, anxiety, nightmares, you name it. I'd spent half my summer in one doctor's office or another, as they all tried to figure out what was going wrong. Mom blamed Dad for having insisted I sent away to military school, and Dad said I had pretty serious problems before I ever even heard of Grant Academy. They fought whenever they saw each other, which was usually only on weekends when Dad stopped by to see me or take me someplace. I was terrified that one time he'd decide not to come back, that it just wasn't worth it. When things seemed to be about as bad as they could get, Chris woke me one morning saying he needed a vacation, so why didn't we take off for a few days? He had the keys to a friend's cabin on Lake Granby in Colorado. I couldn't believe it. Chris never took time off in the middle of a picture, and I knew it wasn't me, who we figured needed a vacation, but I didn't want to ask twice. We left before breakfast, flew to Denver, rented a car, and were floating on the lake by evening. It happened so fast it didn't even seem real. It was like living in a dream. If it's possible for a person to be happier than I was those 3 days on the lake, I'd be surprised. Prep school and doctors and allergies and arguments seemed to belong in no other world, one I could only vaguely remember. Our cabin was surrounded by a cool, dense forest which kept up to the brightest, bluest lake you could ever imagine, a place right out of a postcard. Every day, Chris and I would go out in a boat for hours and fish and swim and talk. The water was so clear sometimes it felt like we were floating on air. In the late afternoon, we'd hike up the side of the mountain or around the lake shore and see deer and rabbits and birds I didn't even recognize. When evening came, I'd bustle around collecting firewood, and we'd cook outside as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Then we'd sit around the campfire talking for hours. I told Chris all about prep school, and it was like talking about the scary part of a fairy tale, where you knew no matter how bad things got, everything would turn out happily ever after. And I told him how one of these days I'd make Dad proud of me, even if he wasn't right now. Then I'd fall asleep outside, staring up at the stars. Bright, sparkly ones, not your dingy LA kind. I'd wake early in the morning, snug and warm in my sleeping bag, to a world that was kind and clean, and where nothing bad could get in. Each morning we'd drive to this little store and call Mom, and I'd tell her about the place and tell her she was crazy not to fly there right away. Then Chris would send me inside to pick up whatever supplies I thought we'd need for the day. And at 11 years old, I felt pretty smart to know they wanted to talk about me. How did I feel? Was I happy? That kind of thing. It was a world created for me, all mine, and 5 senses weren't enough to take it all in. I even got thinking that Mom and Dad would get together again. My allergies would disappear, and Dad would never dream of sending me away to a boarding school again. We'd all be one big, happy family. I thought all this and believed it until the 4th morning. It was Tuesday, a beautiful Tuesday, with the bright morning sun peeking through the trees and a cool breeze blowing across the open porch of the store. This time, Mom stopped me when I started in. She told me the news that only I hadn't known. 4 days earlier, a private jet carrying Dad to New York had gone down somewhere north of Flagstaff. The searchers combing the area had finally found the wreckage. There were no survivors. Dad, his business manager, and the pilot were all dead. I felt like I'd been slammed hard against the wall, hard enough to knock the wind out of me. But I didn't cry. I couldn't. Something inside me had stopped, and that's the part that would have cried. I don't remember much of the trip back to Los Angeles. I had been yanked out of my dream world so fast that my mind was reeling with a kind of mental whiplash. Chris talked to me a lot, but I didn't know what he said, and I didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. At the airport, Mom took my arm and led me to the car. She spoke softly into my ear, and Mrs. Saunders patted my knee as Chris drove home. A while later, we turned onto the Santa Monica freeway. I remember that I had trouble sounding out the letters on the huge green sign. And even when I did recognize the words, I didn't see any point to them or to anything else. I coughed once, twice, and I felt an awful tightness grip me from behind my ribs. It was like someone huge was sitting on my chest. I sat bolt upright and listened as if I were outside myself to the slow, wheezy breathing. My pulse quickened as every muscle in my chest, my whole body, struggled to draw in air. I felt like a distant observer, watching some stupid kid whose shocked eyes bulged and whose hands grabbed for air that couldn't be grabbed. Somebody pushed my head forward over my knees, and I heard a voice shout, "He's turning blue!" It sounded like Mom, but it was coming from far away. I heard coughing that became more violent, and I felt pity for this frightened body which didn't even have a sense to breathe. Bright lights buzzed over me, and strangers in white held my head over my knees. Words floated by me like cartoon captions. I felt I could have grabbed them if I sat up. Certain words came by more than once, and they took on these colorful, three-dimensional shapes. Asthma, nurse, adrenaline. The words didn't mean anything to me. They were just shapes and colors. I tried to raise my head and couldn't. Something cold was put on my arm. A sharp stabbing pain over the cold spot made me jump. I struggled to get loose, trying to remember where I was, why I was being handled by so many people. I couldn't. A light tremor grew from inside my heart into shaking that I could watch in my arms and legs. I heard crying and was surprised to realize it was my own. I cried harder and harder. And someone said it was all right, even though I was crying much harder than Dad would have ever allowed. Once I pulled out the stops, that was it. I was crying like crazy and I couldn't stop. I cried until I could hardly even knew what I was crying about. And I didn't care if Chris saw me or anyone else. And that was strange for me. Even when I was little, I never gave in like that. It was almost like I was crying for all the other times that I'd held it in. And even though I was more miserable that night than I'd ever been, there was something good about letting go, like an awful weight had been lifted from my chest. As I listened to this woman sobbing pitifully, I knew how helpless everybody must have felt being with me that night. There was nothing anybody could do for her. It was something she'd have to go through on her own. Suddenly, I was startled by a change in the crowd. It had grown quieter, more attentive. Opening my eyes, I saw one of the divers disappear under the water. The trooper in the boat was hunched over the edge, peering down, but more intently than before. The spectators slowly and silently crowded the rocky rim, and I sat down, afraid I'd be squeezed into the water. Looks like they got him. Limey's whisper startled me. I'd nearly forgotten he was next to me. The divers and the trooper were awkwardly hoisting something from the water. As the boat tipped up, we could see the body of the drowned man. My stomach lurched, and I looked away. When I looked back, the boat had straightened up, and most of the body was hidden on the bottom. Both divers had scrambled into the boat after it. The sobbing woman was silent now, not even breathing, with a hand across her heart and leftover tears in her eyes. She started bouncing slightly and wrapped her hands around her jaw like some game show contestant waiting to see if her answer was right for the grand prize. I hoped like crazy she'd be wrong. The body would be someone who didn't belong to anybody. The woman turned away from the boat, walked a few paces from the water, wrung her head, and returned. She did this 2 or 3 times until the boat reached the edge a few feet below us. The 2 men around her held her arms as she leaned dangerously over the water. All she needed was a peek, and this awful wail rose from her throat. She would have toppled into that boat for sure if the guys hadn't yanked her back. She screamed and kicked at them as they dragged her away. A few more hands fumbled to help control her, but most of the crowd backed off, looked stricken and helpless. Tyler. It's Bobo Anderson. It's Boo-Boo Anderson, sorry. Limey's eyes were wide, and his jaw had dropped. Against my will, I turned my head to watch the body being lifted toward the waiting stretcher. I almost gagged, but I kept looking. It was bloated and some kind of pale, but not as bloated or pale as I remembered it. Big Fat Buster, perched on his hands and knees, gently lifted the body onto the stretcher, and his face almost looked tender and sad. When the body landed, water gurgled out the mouth past the blue lips and splashed on the chin. My stomach reeled, but my eyes kept watching. As the stretcher was lifted, he gurgled some more water up. Finally, a rescue squad guy came running up with a white sheet and covered him up. Buster cleared a path for the men carrying the body, and they headed for the van. The air seemed hollow, and when anybody coughed or anything, you could almost hear an echo off the rocky ledges. Staring wide-eyed at the body, I had nearly forgotten about the sobbing woman. But suddenly, she broke free of the men and charged the stretcher. She snatched the sheet up and screamed, "Bobby, Mommy's here now! Listen to me, Bobby! Mommy will take care of you!" She shook the body like she thought she could wake it up. She had this kind of distant, scary look, as if she were possessed by demons or something. When her son didn't move, she flung herself at the stretcher and nearly toppled him off of it. Buster gently but firmly lifted her up and led her through the crowd past where we could see. Limey and I stayed sitting on the edge of the rock wall, neither of us caring to see any more. I was thinking about Boo Boo and how I'd never even heard his real name before, or even wondered what it was. I never thought about him as having a mother or anything like that. Boo Boo, or Bobby as his mother had called him, worked at the school. I'm not sure if he was a janitor or only a janitor's helper, but I'd seen him working a lot around school my first week. He must have been around 20 or so, and I think he was a little retarded. He got his nickname because when he talked, he sounded like Boo Boo, Yogi Bear's sidekick. If a water pipe or something would break, he'd say to his boss in this sad, nasally voice, "Gee, Mr. Brimmer, what'll we do now?" That cracked everybody up when he did that, especially the kids who weren't much smarter than Boo Boo to begin with. But he was a nice guy. On the second day of school, after I'd been thrown out of Old Lady Waverly's class for sleeping while I was supposed to be filling out a stupid worksheet, he saw me sitting on a chair outside Mr. Bloomberg's office. I was feeling pretty low. Boo Boo pulled up another chair and asked me who I was. When I told him who I was and what I'd done, he seemed to feel really bad. I told him how everybody laughed at me, and he said, "That's all right. They laugh at me too. Just don't forget, they've done dumb stuff too." I even ended up telling him how it was easier for me to fall asleep around a crowd of people, like in a classroom, than it was for me to fall asleep in my own room at night. And I never told people that kind of stuff. He wanted to know all about California, and I told him. He said he wanted to go there someday. Before he left, he told me that Old Lady Waverly used to put him to sleep too, and that I mean that I was bad. That really got me, Boo Boo caring enough to worry about whether I thought I was bad. My stomach sank thinking about him drowning. Buster growled from behind us for us to get in his car and he'd drop us off in town. When we looked suspicious, he told us there was no charge. We could hardly believe that. And not only that, but he drove us right to my house. As we were climbing out of his car, he mumbled, "That Boo Boo, he spent a lot of money at my place." That's what he said. But I looked at him, and I don't think he cared at all about the money. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 5. Hopefully you found an illusion and a flashback. Flashback was kind of long, and the illusion can be found on page 42. If you have any questions about the worksheet, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, enjoy the story. Stay warm and have a fabulous snow day.